Good afternoon. This is Eva Klain with the ABA Center on Children and the Law, and I want to welcome you to this webinar, hopefully an interactive webinar on domestic child sex trafficking. This is an introductory webinar, and hopefully we will be able to share information with you and allow you to share information amongst yourselves as well. We currently have 3 participants in the room, so hopefully we'll have a few more people joining us. But even if not, then I'm hoping we can have a great conversation both on the phone and in the Adobe room. So this platform that we're using is Adobe Connect, and I don't know how many of you have experience using Adobe Connect previously, but I would like to ask you as we start to use the chat function, which is at the bottom of the screen. And if you wouldn't mind entering into the chat for everyone what your role with trafficked youth or youth who are at risk of trafficking may be. So if you just click in that box and then type that in for everyone, that would be really helpful to get a sense of who has joined us and what your specific interests might be. Thank you. Great. And maybe I could also ask, as you're typing in, if you could share sort of what your level of expertise is. Is this something that you are just beginning to become familiar with, or you have worked on trafficking cases in the past? This was advertised as a sort of a 101, a beginning introduction, but I want to make sure that we can gear it towards those of you who are here. Okay, and may I also ask while we're on the phone, if there's anyone who's joining by phone but is not in the Adobe Connect room? Okay, well, I'm going to leave the line open and just ask that you mute your line or put your phone on mute with your phone, or you can just press *6 in order to mute the line. And then if you want to come in and join the conversation, then you just press *6 again in order to unmute yourself. So I'm just going to go ahead and get started, and hopefully all of you will be able to join in and contribute to the conversation as well. Great. Thank you so much, Margaret, for answering those questions. So hopefully this will provide some information to you and to the others about sort of the basics of sex trafficking, not necessarily about prosecution, but just some of the laws that exist and how both the federal and state systems are responding. So that's great. So I do want to just mention that this is a webinar, part of the series that we're going to have that's brought to you by the Connecticut H.A.R.T Program and also the Division of the Public Defender Services. And I am Eva Klain, and I am an attorney with the American Bar Association Center on Children and the Law. So why don't we go ahead and get started? I always like to start by bringing everyone together sort of on a common definition of sex trafficking. And the definition of sex trafficking that is most widely used is that the one that's found in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. So that is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act when induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in the case of domestic child sex trafficking, or often called domestic minor sex trafficking, in which the person has not yet attained 18 years of age, so 17 or under. And so that means that any child under the age of 18 that is engaged in a commercial sex act is a victim of trafficking. And a commercial sex act is any sex act for which anything of value is given or received by any person. So it doesn't necessarily mean that that money needs to be exchanged. It could be exchange for other goods or for a place to sleep or for food. It just has to be something of value. So I want to address some of the myths and facts about sex trafficking, and I think that really domestic sex trafficking was a response to all the attention in the early 2000s that was being placed on international sex trafficking. There was a big push to address victims who were brought into the country for both sex and labor trafficking or other types of trafficking. But there's often sort of a feeling, a myth that sex trafficking really only happens overseas or people who are brought into the United States, and that it only happens to young girls, when in reality, commercial sexual exploitation and sex trafficking occur all over the United States, and it happens both to boys and girls, and it is happening in cities and small towns across America, there is no area of the United States that's immune from domestic child sex trafficking. And these are myths and facts that I'm going to share with you that were actually put out by the Institute of Medicine. The IOM and the National Research Council joined together to publish this document on confronting commercial sexual exploitation and sex trafficking back in 2013. And so one of the things that they did was identify these myths and facts so that people understand that it's really much more common and pervasive than most people think. So another myth that is often out there is that minors who are commercially sexually exploited or trafficked are recognized as victims of crime and abuse, when in reality, unfortunately, although things are changing, most times, even though they are forms of child abuse, that very often the children and youth who are victims are still arrested for prostitution or detained and incarcerated, or they're subject they are subject to permanent records as offenders in many states. So that is something that many states and the federal government are trying to address, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later, in that there are laws now that victims of trafficking should be considered victims of child abuse and sexual abuse. Another myth is that it's easy for professionals who interact with minors to recognize victims, survivors, and youth for commercial sexual exploitation and sex trafficking. And the fact is that many professionals, many teachers, doctors, legal professionals, and others who interact with youth are really unaware of commercial sexual exploitation and trafficking, and they lack the knowledge and training to identify and respond appropriately to victims as they identify them. And then the final myth I wanted to share was just really that help is readily available for victims or survivors of commercial sexual exploitation and trafficking. And in fact, that's not the case, and there are just not enough resources to meet the current needs. And I think that while there are great efforts at identifying those resources that may be needed and the responses that are needed, the services that victims need are very specialized. And they really do need to be addressed separately and specially from other types of victimization. So, given that those are sort of the myths and the reality of trafficking, I wanted to talk a little bit about what some of the risk factors are. And I had asked a little earlier, I'm sorry, I just saw the comment about the volume. If I turn my volume up, is that better? I hope that does help. Oh, and yes, you need to listen through the phone. I'm sorry. In terms of the computer, the phone line is the way to go. Definitely not the computer, because it's not actually being broadcast through the computer. So I apologize for not explaining that. But for those of you who have used the chat or would like to use the chat now, I just wanted to ask about, what are some of the risk factors that maybe you've seen with the youth that you serve. If there's anything that you've noticed or identified in the population that you might have contact with. And while you're thinking about that, and maybe typing that into the chat, I would say that the chart above can give you a few ideas or the answers that you might be looking for. So there are different types of risk factors. So there's certainly the societal risk factors. There's a lack of awareness of commercial sexual exploitation and trafficking. There's the sexualization of children and the lack of resources that we, on the societal level, are able to devote to this. There are community risk factors, which include peer pressure, social norms, under-resourced schools, neighborhoods, communities, gang involvement. I'm going to talk a little bit about that when we talk about trauma and some of the polyvictimization or the multiple victimization and adverse childhood experiences that occur that make youth vulnerable to sex trafficking. There are also the relationship risk factors, including family dysfunction, family conflict, and of course the individual risk factors, which are related to all of those, including, a history of abuse and neglect, a history of being system involved in the juvenile justice or other systems, and also just stigma and discrimination, based on identity or affiliation. So those are some of the risk factors that have been identified, and this also came from that IOM report that I mentioned. Okay. So when we talk about sex trafficking, there are many recruitment pathways that children and youth might become involved. Surprisingly, family, there was just a recent study that I heard about through the Department of Health and Human Services, where victims of sex trafficking had actually been trafficked by their own family members and accounted for 36% of the victims that were studied, which is a particularly high percentage, or surprisingly high percentage. There are also situations in which the victims are kidnapped. There is peer recruitment where, in the schools or just in places where young people congregate, where there might be, youth who are affiliated with a gang or with a pimp who might recruit other young people to participate in the commercial sex acts as well. Of course, there's violence where youth are forced into participation. The internet is also a mode of or a pathway to participation or victimization, in that there have been places like Craigslist or Backpage or other places where victimization occurs, where young girls and boys are advertised, and there are many law enforcement efforts and trying to shut those down, but they continue. Social media and other avenues continue to be problematic in terms of recruitment and getting children and youth involved in sex trafficking. And of course, there's also just through a pimp, where a young girl may be just befriended by someone at the mall or on the streets, and convinced that this is someone who cares deeply about her, and then, slowly is introduced into the life and is trafficked based on that intimate relationship that the pimp might establish with the youth. And of course, shortly after that, very often violence comes into play as well, and other coercive means to keep that child with the pimp and to keep her involved in the sex trafficking. So those are just some of the many ways that youth are introduced into the sex trade. And there was another study also conducted on youth involvement. This was done by the Center for Court Innovation, and it basically came out with the characteristics and needs of youth in the sex trade. And it was surprising in some ways because the average age at which the youth identified having first been traded for sex was 15.8 years old, which is significantly higher than some of the other earlier reports where, people were saying that youth as young as 12, or that the average age of entry was 12 or even 14. But in this particular sample, it very definitely was an older age group. They were also disproportionately Black or African American. 70% of the interview subjects identified as African American. And they also had arrests for prostitution, but they were quite low. In comparison, in 2009, there were only 1,130 arrests for juvenile prostitution listed in the FBI statistics, but they reported being arrested for other offenses. So while few were arrested for prostitution, 65% were arrested for other offenses, which could include petty larceny, shoplifting, drug-related offenses, trespassing, lack of identification. So really, these other offenses were ways for sometimes even well-meaning law enforcement to get them into the system and try to get them resources. But of course, it has significant repercussions for youth to become involved in the system in that way. And it has, repercussions far down later in life as they try to, as they enter adulthood and try to find employment and things like that. So that was definitely something that this study showed in terms of that prostitution isn't necessarily the charge that sex trafficking victims may be brought into the system under. Another important characteristic of youth in the sex trade was childhood trauma. And I'm going to talk quite a bit about trauma shortly, but it is one of the things that really stands out in terms of characteristics that make youth vulnerable to sex trafficking. And then also a surprising result or finding of this study was that the needs that youth identified as their top three needs were not counseling or some sort of mental health treatment in response to having been trafficked, but really some of the basic needs that everyone has every day: housing, employment, and food for money. And those actually are also some of the things that make them vulnerable to entering the sex trade, which of course, if they need a place to sleep, they may end up trading sex for, a place to sleep or for food or some other basic need. And so it's interesting to hear directly from the youth and know that these are really actually the things that they identify as their top needs, and that really that's where our focus should be, and that's where our resources should be directed. And that's not to say that they don't also need counseling, but sometimes meeting those most immediate needs is really what's needed above the counseling. So I wanted to talk a little bit about trauma. Now, I am an attorney. I'm not a social worker or a psychologist, and so my expertise is not in trauma, but I think it's important for all of us to understand what it is and why it matters. And so the National Child Traumatic Stress Network defines a traumatic experience as something that threatens the life or physical integrity of a child or someone who's important to that child. So in the case of sex trafficking, a youth might be convinced to participate or threatened if they don't participate that some harm will come to someone they love, a parent or a sibling, for instance. It also causes an overwhelming sense of terror and helplessness. It produces intense physical effects. So, they become hard. They become dizzy, and they have loss of their control of bodily functions, and their heart might pound, and it really affects their physical well-being as well. So I included here, and I apologize because it's not a particularly clear graphic, but I do think you're able to at least make it out. And this is the pair of aces tree, and it really it shows graphically how adverse childhood experiences, some of those things that make youth vulnerable to sex trafficking or put them at risk for sex trafficking, are also combined with some of the adverse community environments. So we find that in child abuse that youth who are subject to multiple adverse childhood experiences, what is often referred to as polyvictimization, they are much more at risk for distress and for negative mental health consequences. And really the surprising result of some of those studies is that it's not the repeated effects of a single type of adverse childhood experience, but really the multiple and different types of adverse experiences that make youth even more, put them at even more risk. So long-term trauma or chronic trauma can interfere with healthy development and affect a child's ability to trust others. So this, of course, has a specific impact when attorneys or other social workers, those who work with youth, are trying to establish a relationship, some sort of rapport with the youth. And, of course, their trauma is going to prevent them from being able to trust others. They're also going to lack a sense of personal safety, or they may react in ways to keep themselves safe that maybe are inappropriate or seem inappropriate because, of course, they're completely appropriate to what they have experienced. They may have difficulty managing their emotions, which, again, may become difficult for someone who is trying to establish that relationship with them, especially a helping relationship, that they want to, represent the child in their court case, but can't establish that rapport because of behaviors that the child is exhibiting. And also it makes it difficult to sometimes explain those behaviors in the context of a court case. Children also may find it difficult to navigate or adjust to changes in their lives. And so, of course, when they become involved in the court system, or they might be placed in foster care or have some sort of change in placement, then that is a difficult adjustment for them. And, it's just something that those of us professionals who work with the kids need to keep in mind. And, of course, their physical and emotional responses to stress may be impacted. And, their reactions to trauma are really best understood as adaptations to survive. So they're logical. When a youth has been traumatized, they establish these coping mechanisms or defense mechanisms in order to be able to cope with that trauma, and they will do whatever it takes to survive. And actually, that is a reflection of their resiliency as much as anything else. And yet those reactions are often either misdiagnosed or they're attributed to some other form of mental illness or something that would be treated differently than trauma. And so it's important to remember, in looking at your client population, what their trauma histories may be. And I'm going to talk a little bit about screening, but also looking to see whether they may have any of your clients may have experienced trauma in order to be able to identify them, and therefore provide some trauma-informed legal advocacy. So a lot of effort has been put into creating trauma-informed systems. Both the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges and the American Bar Association have passed policies that allow or that encourage the recognition of trauma and the impact that it may have on children and youth, and also the processes of the court and the legal system generally. Another excellent resource is the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, and I put the link up there for all of you. And they have multiple resources specifically on sex trafficking as well, but also just trauma generally. They have resources for professionals, for parents, for individuals. So I encourage you to take a look at their website. But really creating trauma-informed systems, it really helps us to understand how youth feel, behave, present themselves, and by understanding those behaviors, it helps us remove any judgment that we might put on those behaviors and helps us create a system where those youth can be served appropriately and receive the services and assistance that they need. So how can we as individuals or as a system become trauma-informed? And that is really, that requires a change in the way that we approach our work, the way that we structure our organizations, and also then how we interact on an individual basis with survivors who may be our clients. It also requires awareness of how trauma can affect our reactions, both in terms of any personal trauma history we may have or how we view the behavior or reactions of others. Becoming trauma-informed also requires an intentional development of support. So that includes, those interactions with others, but also internally within an organization, developing policies and procedures that support individuals who are part of that organization, support their own secondary trauma needs and enable them to sustain their work, but also, learn more about how to respond to trauma in the workplace and with our clients. And then, of course, the taking into account that the environment in which we're serving the children and youth are delivered in a way that is trauma-informed as well. So what are some ways that we can identify or screen for victims of trafficking within our clientele? So screening, at least in the child welfare system, is generally conducted by the agency. So it's a good idea to know what your local screening process is, who does it, and what screening tools they may use. There are several screening tools that have been developed for minors. Specifically, there's several that are, real quick screening tools that, as kids come into the system. But of course, attorneys aren't psychologists, and we don't really, once past the screening, we really aren't in a position to provide whatever services might then be identified. But it is important to know what potential victims might be in your caseload, because that will then affect your reactions to them and whether you need to speak with them in a developmentally and age-appropriate way, and then really helping them establish a sense of safety so that they can develop that trusting relationship with you, and that they feel like you will serve them in a way that recognizes and responds to any trauma that they may have experienced. So these are some potential questions that you could ask your clients. I'm not advocating that you dig deep or need to know all the specifics of someone's trauma history. I don't think that most attorneys would either be comfortable or would know what to do with that information. But it is important to identify whether someone who's your client may have been a victim or might be at risk of being a victim. So these are just some potential questions that have been identified to help screen or identify victims as you begin your representation. So really, were you told to do anything that you did not want to do? Were you promised something? Who promised that to you? Did anybody ever hurt you or threaten to hurt you or your friends? Again, that goes back to the trauma, the definition of trauma when someone is at risk or someone that's important to the person is threatened. And, sometimes it's, without just asking outright, you can find out a lot just by asking, where did you sleep? Were you in the same place every night? Did you travel? What did you do at night? These are some of the questions that might help you identify whether one of your clients has been trafficked, and to then respond appropriately as needed. So I want to talk about, I know at the beginning talked a little bit about the definition of sex trafficking, but I want to talk about some of the laws that apply, because there are both federal criminal laws, and then there's Connecticut laws as well, and then there are also laws that aren't, geared towards the criminal justice system, but really much more geared towards the social services and child welfare system as well. So these are some of the federal criminal laws that relate specifically to domestic child sex trafficking. So Section 1591 is knowingly benefiting financially or receiving anything of value from the sex trafficking of children who are under the age of 18. And then 1584, also knowingly and willfully holding or selling someone into involuntary servitude. So those are some of the laws under which charges may be brought. Some of the Connecticut laws that apply, of course, it's important to know that many of the federal laws that have been passed, and I'm going to talk about it in a minute, actually affect what legislation may need to be passed within individual states, such as the Preventing Sex Trafficking and Strengthening Families Act, which had several requirements about how states should, or the child welfare system in states should be responding to victims of trafficking. And so in Connecticut, it states that a person must be 16 or older to be charged with prostitution. And so I think that this is really important because a lot of the what are called safe harbor laws and other similar types of provisions are really geared at making sure that the system treats victims as victims and not as offenders. And so it prevents youth from being brought into the system on charges of prostitution. It doesn't directly address, some of those other charges that I mentioned earlier, where youth are brought in on the collateral charges that are related to, drugs or loitering or some of the other ways in which they might come into contact with the system. But specifically regarding prostitution in Connecticut, at least, the youth must be at least 16 in order to be charged. And then if someone is brought in between the ages of 16 and 18, there is a presumption of coercion so that it would not be viewed as a voluntary act. And Section 53A86 also criminalizes compelling a person, excuse me, to engage in prostitution or profiting from such conduct. And if it's someone under 18, it's a Class B felony. So those are some of the Connecticut statutes that apply. But I want to talk a little bit about the Preventing Sex Trafficking and Strengthening Families Act of 2014. And this was a significant act that was passed that really changed the way in which child welfare agencies address sex trafficking. And so there are about 4 or 5 sections that really are geared towards not only creating a better response to sex trafficking, but also learning more about the process or the pathways to recruitment, or how children and youth get involved, especially those who are already involved in the child welfare system. But also, once they return from, if they run from care, once they return to care, sort of learning more about the circumstances which caused them to run, or what their experiences were while they were missing from care. So Section 101 of the Preventing Sex Trafficking Act, it really focuses on identifying, documenting, and determining what services are needed for children and youth. So the Child Welfare Agency in each state was required to develop policies and procedures on how to respond to youth at risk. And these policies and procedures really were designed to respond or apply to youth for whom the state has responsibility for the placement, care, or supervision, and also for children who have run away from care, and those who may have been receiving services under the H.A.R.T Program. Other sections of the Act include reporting instances of sex trafficking to law enforcement. As I mentioned, the Sex Trafficking Act or Preventing Sex Trafficking Act really focused on gathering more data and learning more about this specific population. So there are requirements to report to law enforcement. There are also requirements that then the agency needs to report to the Department of Health and Human Services, who then must report to Congress as well. And then there's a requirement to capture some data in the H.A.R.T system, the Adoption and Foster Care Analysis and Reporting System, and that then also needs to be shared with Congress. There's also a requirement to increase information on children to prevent sex trafficking. So there need to be reports that describe the characteristics of children who run away, potential factors associated with children running away from care, information on children's experiences while they're absent from care, and really just reporting and summarizing that information so that systems can learn from it and learn where resources need to be focused in order to prevent it. And then also, when youth do run away from care, there must be a report on that absence, that run, with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and also has to be entered into the National Crime Information Center database. And so that's really the focus of the Preventing Sex Trafficking and Strengthening Families Act. And the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act really looks similarly at ensuring that victims are treated as victims and not as offenders. And so that act deals with provisions in the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, and making sure that the definitions of child abuse and neglect and sexual abuse within state statutes includes victims of trafficking as victims of child abuse. So those are some of the provisions that are really focused on this idea that victims of sex trafficking are victims and not offenders, and that they should not be treated as offenders, and instead should receive the services that they need to recover. So I just put that in there because we're just looking for a lot of data, really need the data to support the response, and making sure that it's targeted, that the services that youth need are being provided. So I just wanted to also share some of these resources, and I'm actually going to add here another pod at the bottom that includes resources, and you can, where it says Dcst 101 resources, there are some PDFs in there that you are encouraged to download. One of them is a juvenile defense resource for any juvenile defenders who might be in the room today, and that is specifically on trauma and how to have a trauma-informed practice as a juvenile defender, and things that juvenile defenders should know about youth and how they experience trauma and how that affects their legal cases. And then also there is a brochure that is from the Connecticut H.A.R.T Program about some of the laws and requirements in Connecticut relating to domestic minor sex trafficking and the criminal law. Reporting and definitions are included in there as well, so you might find that helpful. The 113-183 bench resource is something that that was put together by the Capacity Building Center for Courts in a constituency group for court improvement directors and judges. And so there's some great resources in there about screening, about runaway youth, about special court programs that have been established to respond to domestic minor sex trafficking, and you're welcome to access all of those. And then finally, the fourth resource there is also a publication that was put together by the National Child Traumatic Stress Network in collaboration with other organizations on what child welfare attorneys should know about trauma and how it may affect their clients. So those are some of the resources that are available to you here today. And I have just put this up here because I think that really in the end, this is the direction where the laws are moving, making sure that they reflect the fact that there is no such thing as a child prostitute, that children and youth who are victims of sex trafficking are treated as victims and not as offenders, and do not become enmeshed in the legal system in ways that are not beneficial to them. So that actually is all that I have to present today, but I did want to spend, take a few of these final minutes that we have, to get some feedback from those of you who are in the room and sort of open the discussion a little bit about what questions you may have, or, if this is an area of law that you have had some experience in, what has been a good strategy or tip that you've received or advice that you've received on improving your practice with victims of sex trafficking or those who may be at risk. So if there's anybody who has a question, either for me or for your fellow attendees, participants, or wants to share some experience that you've had in some way that you've been able to respond to victims of trafficking, I would welcome your participation. Please feel free to either unmute yourself or speak up on the phone, or if you want to type into the chat. Okay. Well, I am happy to answer any questions or to provide additional resources. I am going to put my email into the chat. Feel free to reach out to me. Happy to provide any resources that you may need. I did just want to ask you, if you wouldn't mind, to complete just a few polls there for us. And I did want to bring to your attention that there will be additional webinars in the series. So we will be doing some webinars on trauma-informed legal advocacy. We will have someone come in who actually has, formed a plan or a model of trauma-informed legal advocacy and has applied it in her own practice. And then we will also look at judicial responses to domestic child sex trafficking, digging a little deeper into the runaway youth and missing youth from care. And then finally, in September, our last webinar will be for juvenile defenders and representing victims of sex trafficking. So I hope you will join us for any or all of those as well. And I thank you for participating, and please feel free to reach out. Thank you so much.